When I was a kid, I had a rock collection with gemstones and crystals and fossils. It was awesome, and I loved it. Now, a friend of mine, he had a rock collection too, and he had more gemstones and more crystals and more fossils, and I was jealous. I remember one time I was over at his house looking at his collection and thinking, man, I wish I had those things. So much so that I actually stole some of the things in his collection. And I went home and I put them in my collection like they were mine. Now, for as far as I know, I got away with it, but man, I felt terrible. And as more time went on, I felt worse and worse about having stolen from my friend. So the next time I went over to his house, I put all the things I'd stolen in a backpack, and I went over there, and when he wasn't looking, when he was in another room, I put them all back because I felt so guilty about everything. When I was in high school, I went with a couple of friends over to a cafe across the street. One of my friends had brought a water bottle, and he bought some orange juice, and he started pouring the contents of his water bottle into the orange juice, and I realized at that time that it was actually alcohol that he had. And I remember thinking, man, this isn't right. I just felt in my heart that we shouldn't be doing that. So I said, guys, I gotta go. And I got up and I left. In Paul's letter to the Romans, he talks about how the demands of God's law are written on our hearts, while our conscience also bears witness, and our conflicting thoughts accuse or even defend us. And that was what was happening with me. My conscience was where God's laws were written. You know, when God forms us in the womb before we're born, he writes his laws on our hearts. And so our conscience knows what's right and what's wrong. And maybe you've experienced that yourself, where you've made a bad choice, and afterwards you felt guilty about it, like I did. Or maybe you had a choice that you had to make, and you knew that one of the options was right and the other one was wrong. And you could just tell because God's law is written on your hearts, and you could hear God speaking to you. The Catechism of the Catholic Church puts it really beautifully. It talks about the conscience, its voice ever calling us to love and to do what is good and to avoid evil. The conscience sounds in our hearts at the right moment. For man has in his heart a law inscribed by God. His conscience is man's most secret core and his sanctuary. There he is alone with God, whose voice echoes in his depths. I just love that imagery that our conscience is our secret core and sanctuary where God's voice echoes in its depths. You know, that's how God speaks to us about what is right and what is wrong in our lives. The problem, though, is that our lives can be so busy and hectic and so noisy and loud that oftentimes we miss hearing what God's saying to us in our hearts and our conscience. The Catechism also talks about this too. The Catechism says, it's important for every person to be sufficiently present to himself in order to hear and follow the voice of his conscience. This requirement of interiority is all the more necessary as life often distracts us from any reflection, self-examination, or introspection. Now, maybe you have that problem too, that, like me, you're just busy all the time. There's all this noise, and we don't get the time to just sit in silence and listen to how God is speaking to us in the quiet, in our conscience. Now, the other problem that we face is maybe we do have time in solitude to listen to God's voice in our lives, but then we hear it and we just ignore it. See, God gave us the gift of free will, so we have the choice whether or not we follow God's laws, whether or not we listen to our conscience when we know, okay, that's the right choice and that's the wrong choice. It's like driving in a car with GPS. You know, the GPS can give you the directions on how to get to your destination, but you don't have to listen to them. You don't have to make that turn. You don't have to go straight. You can do whatever you want. It's the same thing with our conscience. We can choose to listen to it, or we can choose to ignore it. So our challenge in life is to take time in solitude, in silence, to really hear the path that God is leading us towards good, to listen to the voice of God in our sanctuary, in our core, and then to follow it. And that's the challenge that we face every day.